with regards to ethics in particular, from this evolutionary perspective, there's another factor that comes into play. Right? We've already discussed the origins of valuing, right, among species and members of a species, right? Impartiality and partiality. But to talk about values in the sense that will lead towards moral values, right, we have to consider the role of sociality of a species. Right? And sociality is the degree to which members of a species interact with each other in a non-goal orientated manner, in which they socialize with each other. Right? Now, broadly speaking, there are three classes or degrees of sociality among species. You have asocial species who do not interact, where the members do not interact for anything besides the most basic goal-orientated biological directives, right? That is fighting, and fleeing, and fucking, right? So propagating the species, fighting other potential contenders amongst or for mating, right? And fleeing another of the species' territory. Right? That's the sole interaction that they have. By and large, naturally, the giant panda is an example of an asocial species. Right? When the young are born, the mother only keeps them around until they're self-sufficient enough to be able to look after themselves, and then she abandons them. Right? Reptiles are another good example of this, or spiders. Right? Spiders only meet up to screw and reproduce, and mantises as well. Right? Greatest example of asociality out there. I bring you food to distract you while I screw you, and if you finish the food first, you can cut off my head, right? And that's the way the species works, right? Literally, fleeing, fucking, and fighting with the praying mantis. Then you have what are called eusocial species, EU social. Right? These species interact with each other in an exclusively goal-oriented manner. Right? So these are going to be species like bees and ants, where all the members of the species have their place in the colony or hive. Right? And so you really see this primarily amongst insects. But there are a couple of other species that are eusocial like this. There's actually a couple of fish species that are like this, and one or two reptilian ones. Right? So every interaction is purposeful. The individual members of the colony only interact with each other insofar as their individual roles in the colony demand that they interact with other groups. So, like bees, you have the pollinators, the scouts, the queens, the nannies in the case of some species of bee, and the worker drones. Right? The nannies take care of the larvae. The worker drones, they work. They do maintenance around the hive, and they screw the queen. That's basically their job. Queen lays the eggs. The scouts go out and look for pollen, and the worker not the worker bees, the pollinators go and collect the pollen. Right. Sometimes the scouts and the pollinators are one and the same, but in certain species of bee, they're separated. Right. And they only interact with each other insofar as their groups, their roles demand that they interact with each other. So it's all goal orientated. And then finally, you have social species. Right? And social species can be social to varying degrees. But what's key amongst social species is that they will interact with each other in a non-goal orientated manner. Right? They will do things like engage in play in the case of wolves. Right? Young cubs play with each other. Right? Now, young cubs playing with the adults is a means of teaching them strength and how to hunt and things like that. But them playing with each other is a purely social activity. It's not got any direct goal attached to it. Right? There might be some more basic benefit that comes out of it, such as learning how to work together and hunt and pounce with, you know, members of similar strength, future pack members, future hunters that you'd hunt with. But that's not the direct goal of play. It's more of a side benefit that comes from playing. Now, why is this important? Well, to talk about ethics from an evolutionary perspective, it doesn't make sense if we consider asocial or eusocial species. Because we're talking about altruism failure, right? And you can't talk about altruism without, in terms of an asocial species where there is no regard for the other party, right? For the other members of the species. Or a eusocial species where any regard for what others do is purely within the context of their role and the benefit of, successful completion of the role to the hive as a whole. Hail Hydra, right? It must be something that emerges in social species. After all, altruism does not make sense outside of them. Uh, so, consequently, it is only within social species that altruism acquires the needed complexity to serve as the basis for morality.